This is the Collective Voice, and you're tuning into Have You Heard?
Thought-provoking interviews, co-hosted by young adults, fostering deep faith through courageous questions. Welcome all to our this is the first episode we're doing on our podcast called Have You Heard? Here at the 787 Collective at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. This is a new iteration of our podcast. We have a few different kind of channels within our podcast, and one of them is called Have You Heard? And it's really interesting. This kind of spurred out of a conversation I had with Jeb around Christmas time last year, reaching out to me and him basically being like, hey, have you ever heard of liberation theology? And I was like, I have, and I'm a big fan. And so that based on that, there was just kind of this idea of what would it be like to invite young adults to be in conversation around topics that are of interest. And then, hey, if we're reading books or hearing podcasts or hearing interesting things about this specific topic from these people, let's bring them in conversation too. And so we reached out to Damon, who's our guest today, Damon Garcia, to have this conversation. So we're really glad that you're joining us today for this podcast. So whether you're live with us or whether you listen to this later, we're super grateful. It's actually Holy Week this week, which we'll get into in the conversation as well. So if you are celebrating Holy Week, do you celebrate Holy Week? I guess you celebrate Holy Week, right? I typically say have a meaningful Holy Week instead of Happy Holy Week. I feel like Happy Holy Week just feels kind of strange, right?
Right.
So let me do a couple quick introductions just so everybody knows who's with us here, and then we'll dive in because I feel like this is going to be a rich conversation. So again, Damon Garcia is a writer, video, essayist, and a public theologian for Liberative Christianity, which I love the idea of a liberative Christianity. His work is centered around the intersection between liberation and faith. He's the author of the book The God Who Riots, Taking Back the Radical Jesus, which came out in 2022. He lives in Santa Maria, California. And then our other host this afternoon is Jeb Bunting. And he's a social worker, a psychotherapist, and a musician with a passion for mysticism and new ways of imagining faith. And he currently resides in Brooklyn, New York. And I am sitting here in Dallas. So we are pretty well spanned all the way across the country, which is also very fun. So again, this spurred because Jeb reached out. I've known Jeb since he was, I think, in junior high, maybe. Jeb, does that sound right? Many moons ago. And Jeb reached out after he'd read this book and said, hey, man, I'm really curious about this. Have you heard about this? And so we had I hadn't read the book yet, and I'd wanted to because Damon and I had been in various circles together just through other theologians that we know and follow and are in conversation with. And so then I read the book over Christmas break, and then Jeb came over for dinner, and we had a great conversation at dinner in the midst of my kids being chaotic. And then reached out to Damon to see if he'd be willing to join us for this conversation. And that kind of brings us to where we are. And so I'd love for y'all to just say a word of introduction about yourselves as well. And then we'll dive into this conversation on liberation theology. Actually, I want to reframe that. I want to say a liberative Christianity because I really like the way you put that, Damon. And I want you to expound on that in a second too. But go ahead, say a word about who you are.
Yeah, well, first off, I'm happy to be here and also on the first episode. I think that's really exciting. And thank you for having me on. And I grew up in an evangelical setting. Actually, I grew up in a denomination, Foursquare, that was founded by a woman in the 1920s, Amy Semple McPherson, and that was a big deal. There was a lot of talk of course, women should be in leadership. Of course, women should be pastors. And I was on my way to getting a pastoral license. I was doing youth ministry and young adults ministry, and the plan was to eventually plant and pastor a church through Foursquare. But as I kept reading and studying what I needed to read and study, because you have to take this stuff seriously, I found myself disagreeing with a lot of things that the denomination required people to believe. And so I left in the middle of the pastoral licensing process. But one of the books that they had us read during that process was a whole book arguing for women in ministry and looking at a few verses that are commonly used against women in ministry and doing really good biblical exegesis on those verses to show that this is actually something that we should support. But what was so strange about that was what I felt like I was experiencing was, yes, let's take that good biblical exegesis and scholarship and historical research and just apply it to the whole Bible instead of just these few verses that are important to us. And that's something that I think I always felt like when I left evangelicalism, I was following Jesus out of evangelicalism, and Jesus was leading me to something more liberative, more radical. And then I wrote this book for others who always had a suspicion that Jesus was way more radical than what people let on. And I hear that all the time of people who grew up in church and left and perhaps found themselves in more like radical politics settings, is that they look back and they're like, yeah, it seemed like Jesus, yeah, really was more radical. What Jesus was doing was like taking it way further than what I ever saw my church doing. And there was always a ceiling to growth in a lot of churches. And also in progressive churches, there's also a ceiling to growth that gets stuck in just a lot of talk or performative liberalism. And that was one of the things that inspired the book too, was trying to kind of speak to both and show that like there's a way to keep going with this stuff. And when you feel this pain of, I think the church could do better, and I think Jesus is way more radical, like you're experiencing something that has always been felt in the history of religion, including by Jesus and the religion of his day. And so yeah, there's a little bit more.
I love it. I love a little bit more. That's great. Jeb, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit more as well?
Sure. Yeah. So, also wanted to say thank you for having me, Phil, and for asking me to do this. This is wonderful, and glad to be here for the first episode as well. Like you said, you and I have known each other for a long time. I think probably half my life or more, now that I think about it. If I met you when I was in 5th or 6th grade, that's half a lifetime ago, which is pretty cool.
Thank you for making me feel real old, Jeb. That's great.
Sorry, unintended. But I have known you for a long time. Did a mission trip with you back in the day as well. Did a lot of events at the church with you. So, yeah, I grew up going to a church in which Phil was one of the youth pastors at, one of the youth ministers at, and I'll say my story is pretty common in some ways, and I would say it is uncommon in others. But I think my relationship with the church, with Christianity, has changed a lot over the years. When I was a kid, it was a very big part of my life. It was very important to me growing up. Teenage years, early 20s, due to so many theological differences with what I perceived, right, as the message of Christianity, led me away from the church for a number of years. And I think some of those differences were purely theological. Some were more about the social teachings of the church, which is relevant to what we're going to talk about today. But even our church, the one that I grew up in, which was fairly stayed out of the fray, let's say, for the most part, even our pretty down the road vanilla Methodist church, the Methodist church in general took some positions on gay marriage a few years ago that I strongly disagreed with, but among other things. So I'll say my relationship with the social teachings of Christianity has been one that has changed a lot. And the common thread throughout that, though, is that I always had a soft spot for Jesus, even when I disagreed with the teachings of the church. So I always had a feeling there was a redeeming message in there somewhere, that maybe we could flesh out the real Jesus from the constructs over the years. So that's the short version of how I ended up here, I would say.
I love that. I'd love if you just dive in, Jeb. Like when you read this book, I'd love to know what your mindset was, right? But also, I'd love to know what you were feeling in the midst of that too. We're really good about being all about mind and thinking, right, in the church, especially. So I'd love to know like what was really stirring in your soul and at the core of you as you read that book, and really what led you to reach out and to want to discuss it.
Yeah, I think first of all, Damon, thank you for making liberation theology something approachable for a non theologian, for a layperson like myself. Because the way you wrote it was very easy for me to begin to digest these ideas. Right, I had cracked open like a Gutierrez book or a Boff book or one of like the classic texts on liberation theology, and was just like, okay, I feel like I'm in college philosophy class again. I can't hang. So your book was a way for me to sort of dig into it, but what I was speaking to before, right? Like this idea that Christ was actually far more revolutionary, far more radical than people give him credit for, was something that I started to chew on, and was really, really exciting for me as I was reading your book. That combined with the idea that, like, not only was Jesus radical in a theological sense, but also in a social sense, and had some pretty profound things to say about the way society is organized, about the way it's run, about who is most in need of attention and care and love. So it really got the gears spinning for me.
Awesome. That's great to hear. I appreciate that.
So you kind of flirted with a little bit, Damon, at the beginning there, but like, well, one, can you give us the high level lay version of what is liberation theology, and how would you kind of explain that? I actually did a wedding this past weekend, and they were talking about how smart the groom was, and he said, you're the kind of smart where you can explain Bitcoin to a 10-year-old, and I was like, oh my god, that's a wonderful explanation of somebody. So we're not nobody's 10 who's probably listening to this, but if what's your introduction to liberation theology, and then really, like, I know you kind of touched on it at the beginning there, but like, what really got you to the point where, like, I'm going to dedicate enough time to actually write a book about this and get it published?
Yeah, I first found out about liberation theology again back when I was looking through stuff to become a pastor, and in that denomination I was in, and it just made the whole Bible make sense from the beginning to the end. This idea of a God, like, you start out with this God who desires the liberation of Israelite slaves and orchestrates that, and then you see this narrative of the exile. I never even knew the exile was a thing growing up. Like, that part of the Bible was never taught. This idea of, like, they ended up getting a king and they ended up oppressing others, and then they went into exile under the foot of another empire, and then another empire, and then another empire, and then when Jesus comes, they're under the empire of Rome, and again seeking liberation. And their oppression was, like, not about some supernatural afterlife thing like it was told to me, or soul change. It was about physical, real world liberation. And so liberation theology as, like, a specific term was coined in 1968 by a council of Catholic bishops in Medellin, Colombia. But they were tapping into a way of an interpretive lens that has existed throughout the whole history of Christianity, and before that within Judaism, and you can find it within other religions. And it's just, you could see it as like a reprioritizing is what that group of bishops was doing. And a big phrase that they said a lot was that God takes a preferential option for the poor. And that's, like, central to liberation theology, and God takes the side of the poor. But that was actually a phrase that was already in Catholic social teaching, the preferential option for the poor. God takes the side of the poor, so the church should too. The difference is, during that council was happening because it was during Vatican II, when so many Catholic councils were getting together and talking about changes they would make in response to the modern world. And a lot of them were responding to pluralism. That's why one of the changes in Vatican II was having the Mass be in the language of the people, and also being okay with working with Protestants sometimes instead of just assuming they belong to the devil. And the context within Latin America was severe poverty and underdevelopment and colonization. And on top of that, revolutions, anti-capitalist revolutions and anti-colonial revolutions. And what they were saying was, okay, what does God say in response to this? And we believe God is actually on the side of the revolutionaries. And of course, there was a lot of debate on how revolution should be done, but it was ultimately like, the liberation part of this, God is on the side of the poor, not as an object of charity, as just the church gives them what they need, but rather God is on the side of the poor as they fight to take back power from those who have the power to make them poor. Which, that was, like, definitely revolutionary to hear Catholic priests talk like that. And so a lot of them were excommunicated or just ostracized. And the big like anti-communist wave in the 20th century also included working against those liberation theologians. And the Pope at the time, John Paul, was very against liberation theology. And so that's a little bit of it. But of course, like I said, it's something that has existed already way before that. And you could find liberation theology in the ways that African slaves were talking about God. Nat Turner, and the way he talked about God leading his revolt, and other anti-colonial struggles. And and then in the United States and the UK, you get feminist theology, queer theology, disability theology, is all basically making this move of let's look at the theology we've been handed. It's clearly through the eyes of white, straight, well-off leaders. What if we just change the lens we're looking through this and be intentionally contextual and look at it through the lens of the marginalized and the oppressed? And so we see it in all kinds of ways today, but that's like the basic move there.
It's interesting. I had a conversation this weekend, also at the same wedding, talking about this coming up. And one of your friends, Chad actually, was talking about this idea of the preferential treatment for the poor, and how doesn't that just then put this like didn't God want to use like kings, and doesn't God use everybody? And so it led to an interesting conversation about like, what does preferential really mean, right? And it's not like I like the way you just put it, right? Like, it's preferential in the terms of the revolutionizing of and freeing of oppression for those individuals, as opposed to God loves poor people more than rich people, right? Like, because I think that was like the threatening piece that it sounded like whenever he heard it. But I don't, Chad, whenever you listen to this, I'm not trying to minimize your argument about it by any means, but like, I hope that the spelling out of it here is really helpful. So Jeb, I want to hear your thoughts. Go ahead.
Real quick, I think that happens because a big shift people like us go through in our faith is realizing that God loves everybody. Jesus was for everybody, and Jesus absolutely loved everybody, but he said, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who are hungry, blessed are those who are weeping, because those are the ones who needed to hear it. And so I think that's another way to understand the preference there.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah. And Damon, I was going to ask you or comment on something similar. I mean, it's hard to be objective about these things, but my hunch is that if you gave somebody the Gospels and were able to take all and any context away from Christianity, from religion, from Jesus, I have a suspicion that one of the takeaways would be that Jesus really was there to speak to the marginalized and serve the marginalized, the poor, the hungry, the weak in spirit. I mean, it's what we've got is such a different retelling of the story over the years. And so I'm wondering, one of my questions that I'm kind of wondering about is, within liberative Christianity, liberative theology, right? Like, do you see places in America today, in the modern world, where this sort of liberative Christianity is being taught, is being practiced, is being preached? Does it feel like more of a fringe movement to you, or does it feel like something that has some roots?
I think the anti-communist, anti-leftist, anti-revolutionary work that major governments, including the United States, did in the 20th century, part of that, part of what they were working against too was the New Left movement and like critical theory guys. And I think what's interesting about that is what we see now is a lot of the stuff that the New Left was talking about, a lot of the stuff liberation theology was talking about, you can usually only find in academia. But the reason it's in academia isn't because it came from academia, but because it got pushed out of a local setting and organizer setting, and it just got pushed to the academy. And so, unfortunately, that's usually where people will hear about liberation theology and other anti-capitalist ideas, and anti-colonial ideas, and it's like, and movements, and it's unfortunate. But at the same time, I believe that energy is still there, just like it was there before it was explicitly developed. And I think a lot of people very much just feel at their core that, yes, of course, God is on the side of the oppressed. Of course, God wants marginalized people to be free. Of course, these people who are using their faith to justify oppression and exploitation have got something wrong. And I think what's been cool about my work is being able to give language to that. And that's like a big thing that I want to do for people, is because I hear all the time people say like that's what I believe, but I didn't know how to put it. And that's like the greatest compliment. I love when I hear that. And so I think it's something as capitalism continues and colonialism and all forms of oppression continues, that desire for liberation also continues, and a way of talking about that theologically also continues.
I think there's a lot of Christians who do feel that, like in their stomach, like in their guts. Like that's been my experience too, talking to people. I think there's also like a fair amount of Christian or non-Christian just sort of acceptance of status quo, of this, yeah, like it's unfortunate, it sucks, but it is what it is, right? Like this is just the way the world works. And I'm wondering now about like, activating people, motivating people, inspiring people within the context of the Gospels, within the context of Christianity, like to say, no, like this is something worth taking action around. If you've had any experience with that, with getting people moving to address some of these problems. I don't know if there's anything about that you'd like to share.
Mm-hmm. So something that's really inspiring to see is your Grieger, which maybe I'm sure you. Okay, I was just gonna say it's hard to spell if you never heard that, but it's Joerg, Rieger. But he and others have started these things called solidarity circles in colleges and in churches and in communities, where people can gather locally and talk about how they can respond to the needs of their community. And it comes with that organizer lens and that theology lens. I think that's really cool to see. And I also think there's a lot of people, I think sometimes when people hear about this, I mean, specifically church leaders hear about this stuff, their mind usually goes to, we need to start a program. We need to start our own thing within our church, without ever reaching out to the organizations that are already in their city doing the work. And it's like, they have the experience already. They know the needs already. Reach out to them and see how you could be of service with helping with their projects, or even if you have a building, giving space. And I think there's a lot of people who also grew up in church settings and don't realize that they may be more equipped for organizing spaces than they realize. Like I remember the first time I went to DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, years ago, and I noticed there are people walking in and not and feeling awkward and not knowing who to talk to and not really understanding. And I was like, oh yeah, this needs a greeter, like a church greeter. Like there's like a basic hospitality that I learned in church, of getting people on the same page, making sure people feel welcome, that me and my friend who also grew up in church were like, oh yeah, we know how to do this. Like we know how to like just talk to people and make sure they feel welcome and not awkward. And the people who were leading it had no idea how to do that. They didn't have any experience in that. And so I think there's little ways you'll notice when you go into these spaces. Are like, oh yeah, there are ways I could be of help here, even if I don't know. I may feel like I don't know anything, or I don't know anyone. I think it's like taking that step, you'll find that you actually are more well equipped than you may realize.
I love that you brought up Dr. Rieger. He was like my intro to theology professor. The second course I ever took in seminary was with Dr. Rieger, and so much of what you've already said, like he told us that, like, the gospel is always economical, and that was just never a way that I'd approached the gospel before, but recognizing that, like, of course there's an economic aspect to this. And even now I think it's so fascinating that he's at Vanderbilt, because of all the places to be doing this work at Vanderbilt is just really comical to me. But they do incredible work, right? Like I joined a webinar maybe a month ago or so, 2 months ago, the Christian socialist movement, right? Which I did not know was a thing. Like, and there was this, like, there was really fascinating and kind of what you're talking about, Jeb, of like, or no, Damon, what you're saying about like when people hear it and all of a sudden like, oh yeah, this really resonates with what I believe, but I've never heard it articulated this way. Like, so there's really great movements happening, even in places like a Vanderbilt in the middle of Nashville. You know, it's like, I love that you brought up your Gregor. I think he's doing incredible work and really rallying people to do that, like boots on the ground kind of work through the solidarity circles. And yeah, I think that's a great inclusion of how people are recognizing the grassroots movements happening in their community, and the idea of tapping into that already what's taking place in our communities is so important, not having to recreate it all the time. And I think even that is a hard thing for churches because we're so steeped in a colonial understanding of like, well, we'll just do it ourselves. We'll make this ourselves.
Yeah.
And we're going to probably like, we'll do it the best, right? Like there's such an ethos of that lives within us. And it's kind of exhausting. But two, it ends up duplicating and spreading way too thin, whereas we could be supporting work that's already happening on the ground. So thank you for that inclusion. I want to just take us back to this idea of Holy Week, because I do love that here we are, Wednesday of Holy Week. Jeb, you were talking about like you're just reading Jesus and your traction to Jesus, even whenever you kind of stepped away from church for a while. And one of the things you talk about kind of right at the gate in the book, Damon, is this idea of Jesus flipping tables, right? Like the story of Jesus flipping tables. And it's a great story. And it I'd love to know why you lean on it so heavy. I mean, there's kind of an obvious aspect there, but at least like to play out the hermeneutic of reading that text in light of Holy Week and then in light of liberative Christianity, and just invite our listeners to understand a deeper look at that as well.
Well, yeah, first off, the title of the book, The God Who Riots, is partly inspired by, Jesus in the temple and flipping tables. And something that I found really fascinating about that story was learning that when he is in the temple, flipping tables and pouring out coins and announcing to them that you've turned this place into a den of robbers. A den of robbers isn't a place where robbers go and hide. A den of robbers isn't where people are robbed. It's where robbers go and hide. And I think it was always taught to me that it's like he called it that because people were being robbed through that system, which they were. But the point he was making was repeating Jeremiah's also earlier demonstration in the temple, who first said, you've turned this place to a den of robbers. And it's like, if you read that story, that context is clearer. But what I found fascinating about that is so many people who claim to follow Jesus also look around and see their religion used to hide and avoid the injustices going on in the world, because that's what he's accusing the religious authorities of. And then the other thing that inspired it was during COVID and seeing the protests after the police killing of George Floyd, and in Minneapolis, and seeing a live stream of this burning police station and people celebrating and protesters celebrating in front of it. And during the time, we didn't know how long COVID was going to last. We weren't sure exactly how deadly the virus was. And a lot of people during that time are asking, where is God in all of this? And as I'm watching that live stream of the burning police station and protesters dancing in front of it, I thought, that's where God is. And so it's partly inspired by that too, the God who still riots or still is on the side of the oppressed as we struggle for liberation in all kinds of ways. And but I think a lot of people also are, like we said earlier, are inspired by that Jesus who's flipping tables in the temple, a Jesus who stands up for what he believes in, even if that means standing against religious authorities. But another really important thing to note, like I said, he's repeating a line from Jeremiah. He's doing a demonstration that Jeremiah also did. And a lot of Jesus's teachings were also inspired by Hebrew prophets. And so Jesus isn't, of course, trying to end Judaism or create a new religion. And what he's doing is tapping into this line of Hebrew prophets and saying, like they said, God desires justice. God desires justice more than worship, and God desires our freedom, and God desires us to be a nation that blesses other nations. He's reminding people of that stream. And so and then of course we see that stream continue today. And of course I think that stream continues to liberation theology and other types of liberative Christian language that we have today.
Yeah, what about that as a Lenten practice, huh? That's a solid Lenten practice to embrace that.
Good one.
Jeb, I'm curious, like, again, we already acknowledged my elderliness here. So as a young person, right, like wrestling with Christianity and faith and what religion means to you, and what is that? How does that resonate with you and those you're in conversation with, and the exploration of faith as a young adult?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. It's a great question. I have maybe a slightly different demographic. I'm not in the theological world either, and so the conversations look different. I mean, look, the vast majority of my friends, people I hang out with, people I talk to, are non-religiously affiliated. Vast majority, at least of people my age. Maybe not anti-religion, but just not affiliated. So when these questions come up, right, and in some ways, I feel like I need to be the defender of a different kind of Christianity. But ultimately, what usually ends up happening is, within the context of social movements, of liberation, of activism, religion almost never gets brought into it by most people. It's just not where people's minds go, right? So to say, actually, there is a way of reading the gospel of Jesus, of reading these stories that's actually quite revolutionary and actually very pro-social change. And there is a God who's on the side of the oppressed, is something that is new to a lot of people, I would say, at least the people that I interact with. So that being said, within the circles I'm in that are Christian, that are active in a church, or at least in a faith tradition, most of those people are fairly progressive and fairly pro liberation in general. But I'm not sure even many of those people see the connection between religion and faith and that. I mean, and I believe you touched on this in your book, Damon, but like a lot of activism, I would say most now exists in the secular space, at least for most people. And so seeing the church as having a role in something, in a movement as progressive as this, I think is a new idea for a lot of people. And so, right, we can look at like all the historical liberation movements that were influenced by faith. We can look at the civil rights movement. We can look at many others. We can look at Gandhi in India and that movement. But today it seems to be mostly secular activism. So I think the world has changed in that way. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does.
And I wanted to say too, I think what we see in different liberation theology movements, and then also different Christian socialist movements, is like, especially during the 20th century and 21st, is there are those who approach it as Jesus has called us to take care of the poor, and there's a way to read my faith as drawing me toward joining these movements and fighting for liberation. And then there's another approach, which is, I have my faith, but when it comes to materialist questions, we need materialist answers. Like
Right.
when it comes to the question of how do we structure the economy, it's, instead of going through, well, I think if we look at this perspective of Jesus and string these verses together, we could find, instead it's, yeah, that's just my faith. That's separate. Let's have a materialist answer for that. Let's look at the ways that a different structured economy can actually help people and free people and lead to more equality. And then when it comes to other questions that are more spiritual or more about consciousness and like, what are we, what unites us spiritually, then we could bring religion into that. And so I think I would lean more in that direction, where it's like, it's, well, I'm both, but I think it's like, yes, I feel like Jesus and the way of Jesus and the Bible inspires me toward liberation, but at the same time, it's like, what was happening in secular spaces, organizing and fighting for justice. It's like, I would say let them take the lead, and Christians could work alongside it.
Well, and sadly, so often they're taking the lead because when you talk about it in the book, right? There was no individual salvation in much of these texts, in much of these writings, right? It was always a collective mentality as well as a collective sinfulness, right? Like the people of Israel was who were being addressed by the prophets, right? Not just one specific person's sinfulness. Like it was a collective mentality. And so in some ways, following those who are doing this work in secular spaces, it's just it's in some ways it's a continued oppression by saying like, if we can keep this side over here in the spiritual realm and this side over here and like keep them in their separate corners and make sure they don't ever get mixed, it's not that pretty. And two, like that's terrible dualistic thinking where the reality is like, of course it's all enmeshed, right? And the material is the sacred, like that's the whole, what are we celebrating at the incarnation if we don't recognize that of course the material is the sacred and there is no just materialism. There's actually just, what is I think it's Richard Rohr talks about the Christ-soaked world, right? Like of course it's all one and the same. And so I would love to hear if you have more to expound on the idea of, the faith being the movement of an individualized faith. And I do hear that from young adults sometimes too, right? Is they're engaged in this kind of like bifurcation of, I want to have my own faith and not like have to meddle with other people's faith because that's their own, you do you kind of thing, versus them having this social idea of like, well, it is kind of a more collective mentality. So sometimes it plays out one way, even if they do bifurcate it mentally for themselves. What are your thoughts on that, Damon?
I think things get really confusing when we reduce faith to a set of intellectual beliefs. And for a lot of people, that's all it is. It's the set of ideas I have in my head. And other people can have another set of ideas in their head. And that's it. But we see throughout history, the way that people live out their faith is action, is community. And of course we have different ideas in our head, but that doesn't matter as much. But I think part of that is due to Christian colonialism and going to other cultures and saying, well, all you have to do is just have the same ideas in your head like us. And that's what you are. And even like going to different cultures and labeling them a religion, like colonizing India and saying, what is your religion? It was such a ridiculous question. It's like, this is just how we live. And they were like, okay, your religion is Hinduism. And it's like, and so it's like reducing their whole culture to, we're Christians, you're Hindus, and you got to believe like us. And so it's such a weird way of viewing faith. But you're right that the way that historically faith has always been talked about is communally, not so individually. And it's communal sin and communal forgiveness and communal salvation and liberation. And I think a lot of young people feel a lot of pressure these days to have their life figured out and God's calling for their life figured out all by themselves, because we've reduced the idea of calling too individualistically, which is you got to figure out your individual personal gift that God gave you. And you got to figure out how you're going to live out that gift personally and how you're going to monetize it and turn it into a career and climb until you die. And you better make sure you get the right one because God only has one for you. And it's like, that's so foreign to the way historically gifts and calling have been talked about. And like even in Paul, when he's talking about spiritual gifts in Corinthians, he's talking about the community has gifts, not each individual take a spiritual gifts assessment and figure out your spiritual gift. It's the community has gifts. And when we come together, those become manifest, and someone will have a word. Someone will be able to do this. Someone will be able to do that and sing a song. And it's like, we've lost so much of that community aspect when we talk about faith. And I think, it's really important. And I think it takes off so much of the pressure when we could think of it from a communal lens and understand like together we have gifts, together we have a calling, together we are doing the work of God, instead of this individualistic pressure and guilt tripping and shame of like, oh, I'm not doing what God called me to do. It's like, what is your community doing? Then you're doing.
It strikes me as could be such a place of healing, right? For people that feel, I mean, just in the way you described, need to figure out your career, need to figure out God's special plan for you and only you, and you need to do this all on your own, and you need to have it figured out by age 22 or whatever the blueprint is that stresses so many kids out. And I actually work in a college counseling setting now, so I see this all the time. And the hyper individualism, the emphasis on the individual and success and pressure, it's so unhealthy in such a number of ways. And so when you're talking about this, it strikes me of what a place of healing this could be, to see our faith, but also our lives in the broader sense as a communal effort and a communal push. I'm wondering, how do we do that? What does that look like in our culture, which is so hyper individualized on every level? Faith, economics, life choices, it's all been reduced to the individual. So what do you think it looks like to move into this, I was going to say new way of seeing things, but really it's the old way of seeing things? What does that look like?
Yeah. I'm really not sure, but so the inklings of imagination that I can grasp is, I think it can start small with you and a friend or two friends or someone in your family being able to understand that part of being human is being interdependent, depending on each other and looking out for each other. And then another thing is, like, we need third spaces. Like, people talk about, you go to work, you go to home, and then the idea of a third space of people to just gather and hang out and talk together and congregate. The way especially cities are set up, those are dwindling away, and several cities aren't existent anymore. It's like wherever you go, it's no loitering and you can't be here. Where are you supposed to be? And it's like, I think there are a lot of things in the ways that our communities are set up that make it so much harder. So it also for those who feel like it's really hard, of course it's really hard. It's not your fault. It's really hard to find community or to form community. And the world was set up this way to keep us individualized. And it's because that's how oppression continues, is by keeping us thinking we're individuals and not connected to other people who are experiencing what we're experiencing. And you can reach the position of the owning class by just working really hard. But it's like, no, actually, there's way more of us than there are of them. And solidarity is how we start to get organized and change things. And it's so yeah. What do you think, Jeb? Are there ways you think we can try to bring community back into this?
Speak for all young adults, Jeb.
I got everybody covered. I'm not even young anymore. It's Phil. I'm pushing 30 now, man. I'm almost there. I don't know, right? I don't see those spaces within a religious context right now. I see them in all sorts of other places. I see them in communities, like you said, like third spaces, where people gather. I mean, for so many people, it's like an exercise class, like a thing that they're really into. They go to yoga, or they go to CrossFit or Pilates or what have you. But, you see them in clubs and the ways people bond in activities. And of course you see them in like activist spaces as well. Right. So I think I imagine it more as a person of faith bringing themselves into these other spaces, rather than necessarily just finding them solely within places of faith. But I also look. I'm interested in Christian communities, right, that are doing this as well. And I know you talked a lot about the book about, and I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head, these communities in South America. What were they called again, Damon?
I don't know.
This.
Are you referring to?
Well, it might come to me. But anyways, I don't. What I was saying is, I'm not sure I see them in a religious context right now, and I'm hoping that changes. But I see them more in a secular context.
Yeah, and I also think of the past where we're able to see with a clearer view that periods where the church was definitely on the wrong side of history. And we see those who left the church and didn't have any religious community during, like, when in the United States, when the majority of churches were pro-slavery, those who were against slavery didn't really hardly had a home or left communities. And there was a term back then for people who left communities, pro-slavery churches. They're called come-outers. And they would just like casually be written about in newspapers sometimes. So-and-so who's a come-outer. It's somewhat like the term ex-evangelical today a little bit. But, and then when the majority of churches are pro-segregation, it's like we're able to look back on that and say, those who experience like a lonely faith or had to walk away from their faith entirely, it's justified when that was the environment you're in. And I think in the future, we're going to look at today's period in a similar light and understand that, like, oh yeah, of course it was hard for the Christians who weren't participating and perpetuating the violence that the majority of the church is doing. And yeah, and I think we tend to think that we tend to not realize like how dominant these oppressive institutions and versions of Christianity are in our society. And so, like I said, of course it's hard, but the world was set up this way, which means that it can change. We can change to another way, but yeah, it takes time, solidarity, work, definitely.
Yeah, people made conscious decisions to get us to where we are. We can make conscious decisions to get us out of where we are, right?
Mm-hmm.
So some of the work we do at 787 Collective is really trying to bridge that gap between kind of this entrepreneurial spirit that is bubbling up with a lot of young adults, and they are creating gatherings and third spaces to seek spiritual formation and ongoing faith formation, or just community in general, right, beyond congregations. But we also work with a lot of congregations who really want to do, I'm going to say the right thing, but maybe the right thing's not the right word. Maybe like they want to know how to engage in this work in a way that is more relevant for young folk, right? That want to embrace this spirit that you've talked about, Jeb, and provide a space for young adults who want to engage in this work. So for either one of you, really, like one, are you seeing churches do it well? Have you seen any, not just churches, but I guess faith communities in general who have done this well? And then two, if somebody asked you, like, what would it take for us to be better at this? What would you suggest to them?
What do you think, Jeb?
Yeah, I don't have I don't have as much exposure to different churches as you guys. I think you guys have I have one. So
but maybe that's it though, right? Like maybe that's the whole point, is that you don't have as much exposure. So if someone was really curious of wanting to like meet you where you were in the midst of this, what would you want to see out of that?
Yeah. Could you say that one more time, Phil? The question.
Yeah, just like creating a space that is a liberative expression of faith, right? So it's a space for engaging in the activism that you were talking about, and that comes by promoting liberation of all people, not just some, right? And really embraces this kind of conversation that we're having, and not just the conversation, but then puts boots to the ground and really does the work as well. What would you want to see in the midst of that?
Yeah. Well, I think it makes me think of, there was a moment in your book, Damon, where this brought to mind, where you talked about bringing a friend who was, or the idea of bringing a friend who was gay to a church service, if I recall correctly. And I think if I was to, bring somebody into the space where I worship, the space where I go for church, for any reason, I would want to make sure it was a place that was truly inclusive of people, and a place that I don't think that they would be uncomfortable in. I wouldn't want to bring somebody in if I was worried that they might hear something from the pulpit that was going to deny them or who they were, their experience, their identity, anything like that. And so I think that would be kind of just the basic, I think, requirement to bring somebody else into that. And I think conversely, if I was somebody coming in to church for the first time or coming back after a long time, I would want to see something like that for myself as well. And so I think just kind of a base level, kind of ground level tolerance, of open-mindedness, of affirming people who they are and where they're at, not just giving it lip service, but like actually meaning it, I think is kind of the ground that the rest of it needs to be built on. I'm not sure it works if you're trying to do activist work, but also saying, yeah, but not really for you, or yes for you, but not in specifically the way that you are. We need you to change a little bit before you can be a part of this. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah,
but I think that
you actually had, Damon, in the book, you had that Heschel quote, right, about what drives people away is hypocrisy, not heresy, right?
Yeah,
I forget the exact quote, but something like that.
Yeah, it's a big one. And I think another way that a lot of spiritual leaders need to see their community is it's not I think a lot of them just see it in purely an inclusive or tolerance mindset of, well, let's just make the circle a little bit bigger. Let's just make space in the pews, even more space for people who previously weren't included. But I think how we need to view it is allowing our communities to be changed by these people who were previously excluded. And I think the same goes for young people too. And when it talks about, like, when you talk about being a space for young people, or reshaping the community for young people, ask the young people. And I think it's in understanding, if we want to be a space for young people, we have to allow the young people in our community to change us, not exactly just opening space for more young people. And so, and I think for whatever community that a spiritual community wants to reach out to, you have to be open to being changed by that community instead of just opening your arms a little bit more.
I love that. That's fantastic. Beautifully, wonderfully said. I kind of want to close on that, but I want to make sure there's space to, if Jeb, if you had any other questions that you really wanted to bring forth to Damon, or if Damon, is there anything you didn't get a chance to say, I would love to provide space to that before we really wrap up.
I think I've fired all my questions.
Well, Damon, a final Holy Week thought for all of us?
Yeah, I think in your journey, as you follow this radical Jesus, or become more interested in this radical Jesus, you're not alone in that journey, and you have not gone astray, as many Christians may have you believe, that you were so good when you were a church kid, and then as you got into some of this more radical stuff, you've lost your way. But it's not at all. If we're talking about the God of the Exodus, if we're talking about the God who's on the side of the oppressed, then you've been on one long journey consistently, and it's going to look all kinds of ways. Of course, it's going to look all kinds of ways. And so, yeah, the last thing I'll say is, your journey, as it changes, as it shifts, as you find yourself in communities you may have never thought you would be a part of, that's how it works. That's how it looks when you do the work of God that is actually the work of liberation. And so, thank you for having me. And I appreciate, being able to speak with y'all.
I'm really grateful for your time, Damon. Yeah, it's been awesome. And Jeb, thanks for approaching me and wanting to have this conversation. This has been awesome. And let's do this. Damon, if people want to find your work, where can they find you at?
You can find me, I'm on Instagram, mostly at Who Is Damon, and on YouTube, just Damon Garcia. I'm also on Substack. That's where I'm doing a lot of writing now. And so, find me on there. Hit me up on Instagram. Say, hey, I heard you on the 787 Collective podcast. That'd be cool. And so,
love that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then my book, The God Who Writes. Check that out,
definitely too. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, gentlemen, thank you for your time this afternoon, and a blessed Holy Week to you. Let's go with that one rather than Happy Holy Week. I hope it's a meaningful experience. And keep up the good work that you all are both doing. I'm just grateful for your conversation and what you're standing for and what y'all are doing in the world.
Thank you, Phil. You too.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for all listening, and we'll be back with another episode soon.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Collective Voice,
the premier podcast of the 787 Collective.
Click the link in our show notes to connect with us and learn how you can be the lucky recipient of free 787 Collective swag.
And don't forget, when you rate and review us, you're tricking the algorithm for the common good.